Hello, welcome to another episode of Tiny Nest. I'm Kiva.
And I'm Jake. This series is following our tiny house project from the early stages through to completion and beyond.
This episode is part one of our windowsill installation.
We're working on the window sills now, and we're just using this 2.5 inch wide fir. Pretty much looks like this, and it came in like 10-foot lengths. And so the first step was to just cut all the pieces. We basically got sort of like a top plate and a bottom plate spanning the whole width, and then the vertical pieces span in between the top and bottom. So the first step was to just cut all the pieces, and I just got them dry fit in around all the windows. And the first thing I'll mention about it is that the top and bottom pieces, it doesn't really matter how nice or perfectly fit the ends are, because the way that the trim is going to go on, like the actual window trim, will cover that corner. So what you will see is where the side pieces meet the top and bottom, and also just like half of the width of the face here, where it meets the bottom edge, of the top piece, and the mirror version of the on the bottom as well. The next thing I considered was that when I'm dropping the chop saw down to cut these pieces, the fibers of the wood get a bit blown out on the back side where the saw, based on the way the saw is spinning, and the other side is quite nice. So if there were any other imperfections on the wood, like a knot or some kind of scuff or something that I wanted to make sure was hidden when it was in its final installation, I was mindful of where that was on the wood and how that affected the orientation as I chopped it, so that the blowout would be on the same side as the imperfection, so that I would hide both the blowout and the imperfection based on which way I put the piece in for its final installation. With those things in mind, the next issue I'm having to deal with is that it seems like the 2.5 inch width would be good for like 1/2 inch drywall, which is pretty common, or some kind of 1/2 inch siding, but we've got this 1/4 inch ply basically. So the window sills here would be too proud. When we go to put on the trim, we'd be having to deal with it being uneven with the wall paneling. So I'm gonna have to slice these down basically, and the way I'm doing this is when I dry fit them in, I'm facing them so that all the blowout is facing me initially. Then I'm taking this scrap that I've got to cut for the corner and basically holding it up against the framing here, tight, make sure everything's tight, and then marking against the piece on all the way around an indication, so that when I run it through the table saw, I can slice off the exact right amount so that it will end up being perfectly flush with this. This is kind of me making up for some imperfections that we made really early on. The framing was something that was one of the first things we did, and we'd never framed anything before, and we weren't super precise with getting things flush like on this plane on the framing. So for example, like we've got it sort of a jack stud here for the header, right beside this king stud. So these two pieces of wood, when they're like this, they may be a bit off this way. They're not perfectly flush. And then that goes for everything. So we've got like the sill, the piece of framing for the sill down here, and then the header. So let's say, for example, the header was slightly in from where this stud is, and this sill was slightly out from where this stud is. When we go to put the paneling on, this piece of paneling that's tied up against the window sills that I'm working on now might be a little bit out, whereas this one might fall a little bit in. And so if I ran this through the table saw perfectly straight to slice it down for, say I just put this right up against here, made a mark, and used that as my only reference and slice it that much off, I could still end up with an imperfection where, it's proud here, and then the panel is proud down here, and then the trim won't fit. So I don't want to deal with the trim, which is supposed to be the nicest looking finishing step, and try to mess with that each piece one at a time to make it look good. I'd rather mess with these pieces, try to get them so that they're going to be as flush as possible with the paneling, so that the trim is the easy step, and I'm doing the work now. So it's a bit long-winded for what seems like a simple task, but I'm going around to each corner, making sure everything's tight, holding my piece of panel tight and making those marks. And then when I go to the table saw, I've got a jig that I'll show you where I can actually adjust the angle. I don't need to mess with the fence and everything each time. I've got a thing where I just clamp it down the right way and I can run it through and get whatever slight angle. If there's something slightly off, my cut will account for that, and I'll end up with the best result for how even the sill is with the paneling. Okay, I've got my set of pieces for window number 2, and they're marked from where I held up my little scrap of the wood paneling. And this piece is a good example because the marks on the two ends are slightly different from each other. And so that's why I put together this jig. So I basically just screwed some pieces of wood together with a gap inside big enough that I can sleeve my sill pieces into it. And I've even got a little bit of cardboard in there just to minimize any scuffing or anything, marking of the pieces. And so I screwed this together, and then I set my fence to a good depth here and ran it through. And as long as I don't change the position of the fence, I can just keep running this through indefinitely, and the blade is always going to run along right on this nice crisp, freshly cut edge. So what I can do is take my piece and I'm going to slide it in here. I'll try to keep it in the cardboard as much as possible. That. Okay, and now you can see that this piece, I could put this piece at an angle if I wanted to. And then when I run it through the saw, it's going to cut, like this piece is going to get cut at whatever angle I've got it set inside here. So all I need to do is line up the nice hard edge here with my pencil marks on the sill piece, on the two ends. And I've just got these screws on the ends that allow me to sort of cinch it down so it doesn't go anywhere. So now it's tight enough that this piece isn't going to move, and now I can run it through the table saw, and simply because of the fact that I've lined this end up and this end up, if there's any difference between them, it's going to produce a line, like a cut line, that will be at whatever minute angle it needs to be to make sure that this piece is going to fit and it's going to be flush with all the paneling. One other thing that I'm having to deal with already, having not even got that far in this process, is that when I made all my cuts for all these pieces, the chop saw was slightly off of square. So it's kind of a cheap chop saw, and I would just use like the written markings to line it up with 0 degrees, but it was not perfect, and I didn't check it with a square ahead of time, which I probably should have. So all of my cuts are a little bit off, and I'm gonna go and fix them. The good news is that because the top and bottom piece I already mentioned, the ends don't matter because they're going to be totally hidden, that sort of halves the potential work that I might have had to done. But all the side pieces I'm going to have to do. So I'm taking them all, I'm making sure to chop them in the same orientation as to not create blowout on the side that I made good and with the first cut. But this is also going to mean that some of my tight fits that I have here are going to be there's going to be a gap that I'm going to need to deal with. But I do have a solution for that already. I'm basically just going to shim it out so that I'm shim the top and bottom pieces so that it closes down tight on there. I'd already planned on using some sill gasket, like laying sill gasket around before putting these pieces in, basically to create a bit of a thermal break between these pieces of sill and the framing that's right around it, which could get cold. I mean, it is wood that's solid wood right up until the outside sheathing, so there's no insulation really. So anyway, I'm going to try to isolate this. Windowsills are prone to like condensation and stuff, so that's all part of that plan. But it's also going to help to close up those gaps. I had noticed a little bit of a slope in some of the seams here while I was putting them in, but I was just thinking that it was because when we were doing the framing, we sloped the sill, so I thought that this bottom piece was sitting at a bit of an angle, and that was creating kind of like a gap, and that's what I was seeing. But so I did the whole thing and didn't realize that my saw was out, so now I'm just having to deal with that. Now I'm going to re-square my left and right piece ends by just slicing as little as I possibly can using my readjusted chop saw angle here. Okay, I've trimmed all my pieces to what I think is going to be good, so I'm going to put them all back in and see how it fits. My first attempt to make these cuts before I took all the time to make that jig was just make a pencil mark with a straight edge, and then just skill sawed it very carefully, but still freehand, and it was not good enough because this surface of the vinyl window is so perfectly flat that if this cut is not perfectly flat as well, it's extremely obvious. So the way I've got it running through the table saw is going to make this nice and flat against the window. It's just a matter of making sure that both from piece to piece it's flush, and then from both these pieces to that panel is flush for that trim. Okay, I tweaked things a bit and checked it again, and everything's looking pretty good now. And I think I've sort of got an idea of how to make the most out of my jig. But before I do the whole rest, I obviously have created a gap up here because I trimmed these side pieces down slightly. So I'm going to test fit the sill gasket to see how well that's going to snug things up. Alright, I just sliced some pieces of sill gasket and masking taped them to the back sides of the pieces so that it wouldn't be flopping around while I was putting everything in place, and it worked perfectly. I actually put an additional thin strip on the bottom because of the way that we made the sill pans slope, so that sort of re-leveled the bottom piece, making sure there'd be no unsightly seam where these pieces meet. And because of the extra basically shim that I've added, it snugged it down, and I actually had to kind of work it into place. It's not like crazy tight, I didn't have to use a hammer or anything, but it's nice and snug, so these pieces are actually not going to go anywhere, which is perfect because even when I go to nail these down, I'm going to basically kind of wedge them in. They'll be just held by friction. I can get them to be just where I need them, and then stick the nails in, and it'll be good to go. Hopefully it will never buckle. That's the only thing about it being nice and tight, that if it were to expand, that would be bad. But we are going to be treating these with a coating that will, it's like a clear coat, so it'll be sealed against moisture. And these pieces of wood have been sitting in the tiny house for numerous weeks already, so it's kind of, the house isn't finished and in its sort of temperature/humidity condition that it will be in. Basically what I'm getting at is that hopefully the shape will not change after we treat it and then install it, so that this amount of nice snug and tight fit will remain through to the finished product.
If you want to see some of our previous videos, click on the preview tiles, and subscribe if you want to follow our progress. You can also visit our website here.